Hi students, this class is about measurement in marketing research. And by now you've already covered the different types of research methods that there are. So we talked about exploratory research, descriptive research, and causal research. And then once you decide to go for a specific type of research, you probably wonder how you measure concepts. Like, for example, if you conduct a survey, how do you measure specifically people's attitudes, people's feelings, people's opinions, and so on? Obviously, sometimes you can ask a straightforward question, but in many cases, it's not as easy. So measurement is really important because, first of all, in marketing is basically applied psychology. So we measure higher order constructs such as consumer loyalty, satisfaction, attitudes, and so on, or personality traits, and they can be pretty complex to measure. Usually, we ask several different questions to get to the same concept. So several different questions can, in a joint way, measure a specific construct. Secondly, measurement is important because the level of your measurement matters a lot and has implications for the statistical data analysis you can do afterwards. So depending on how you measure your construct, let's say for example on a ratio scale level, it allows you to calculate certain things such as a mean or a median, and that is not possible with every measurement level. So in other words, if you don't want to put yourself in a dead-end street when it comes to analysis, it's really important to keep measurement in mind when you're designing your questions. So what we cover in this online class is different question response formats, and this is pretty intuitive. Then we're going to go over 4 different types of measurement levels: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. And this is incredibly important. I cannot stress the importance enough. If needed, definitely pause the video. Make sure you think of different examples yourself, because this will be crucial to understanding analysis. And then lastly, I'm going to go over a couple of commonly used marketing research scales. In the first session, we only focus on the different question response formats. The other stuff we keep for a separate session. So the 3 main basic question response formats are open-ended questions, categorical questions, and scaled response questions. So the open-ended questions are pretty intuitive and pretty easy to understand because they're usually just questions with an open answer, so that allow respondents to answer in their own words very easily. So within the open-ended questions, we have an unprobed format or a probed format. And an unprobed format seeks no additional information. It basically just asks people, for example, what criteria did you use to evaluate a candidate? What do you remember from the series Breaking Bad? What do you do currently to improve diversity and inclusion at your team? So these are very straightforward questions of fact that don't really dig any deeper. They basically just ask people something. Person answers, simple as that. So the good thing about it is that people can answer in their own words, so respondents can use their own words in formulating an open-ended answer to that question. The downside, however, is that it's difficult to code and interpret. So on the researcher's end, there's more work when it comes to coding this qualitative data. So since the answer is open and not numerical, people can obviously give longer answers, shorter answers, and reading through all of those and coding them in order to interpret the results is much more tricky. Lastly, respondents could potentially not give complete answers. Maybe their answers are incomplete simply because they're a little bit lazy. When you ask them a certain question, they respond pretty quickly. They don't type everything they know or everything they think of with these unprobed formats. So this is where the probed format comes into play. A probed format seeks additional information, so asks respondents to think a little deeper by questions such as, is there anything else? Is there anything more you can think of? What could you tell me more? And so on. So you still have those same advantages of allowing respondents to use their own words, but in addition, they also elicit more complete answers because you use a probed format. The downside is still that it's difficult to code and interpret because, again, you're dealing with open-answered questions, open answers, which are a bunch of reading work and trickier to code because it's essentially qualitative data at that point. The second basic question response format is categorical. And again, like the word says, categorical questions are not open-ended because they give you different answer categories that people can pick as their answer. For example, an open-ended question could be, tell me about your study habits, which could basically be taken in any direction. People could talk about their study habits in terms of whether they study in the morning versus late at night, whether they study solo versus in a group, whether they study a lot or not that much, whether they study with music or not. So basically, a respondent can interpret this question in many different ways when it's open-ended. Now, with a closed-ended question or a categorical question, you provide answer categories for the respondent, and you can, in this way, give more direction to where the answers are going. So a closed-ended question could be, how much time do you spend studying? And giving several answer options in terms of time, amount of hours. And this way, respondents know that it's specifically about time spent studying and not, for example, about whether they study with music or not, or whether they study alone or in a group. A very simple categorical question would be a dichotomous question, and a dichotomous question is also called a dual choice, where you just have two answer options only. So it's very straightforward, it's very easy to administer and code, but the downside is that sometimes it may oversimplify response options because some things are just not black and white, are just not yes or no only. There's a lot of variables that should be measured on a certain continuum, on a certain degree or intensity. But for certain questions, actually, dichotomous or dual choice is excellent. For example, have you ever been to Europe? This is either a yes or a no. There's no in between. You either have been or you haven't been. So this is pretty clear. Now, multiple response options or multiple choice is also very commonly used in survey research, and that's where you give respondents multiple answer options. For example, what's your favorite movie genre? What's your favorite food? And you give them a couple different answer options. Or if you were to buy a new laptop, which brand would you be most likely to buy? And then give them several options. For example, Apple, Acer, Dell, Lenovo, and so on. The good thing about multiple response or multiple choice questions is that it allows for a broader range of possible responses. So you don't try to fit your answers in a yes or no box. It allows for more response options. It's still very easy to administer and code as a researcher because it's numerical. So you just assign numbers to each of the answer options, and this way it's very easy to code. The downside of multiple response or multiple choice questions is that as a researcher, you have to make a very clear distinction between pick one or pick all that apply type of questions. The reason why this is so important is because it has implications for coding and for understanding your data. Imagine you present people with a question, what types of food do you like? And you give them several different answer options, but you tell them to pick only one, basically their one single favorite food. In that case, you will code differently than if you were to instruct people to pick all that apply, when they can check multiple boxes of food that they like. In that case, your coding changes completely. A second potential disadvantage could be a recall or a recognition situation where you might accidentally alert respondents to answer options that they were unaware of. So for example, the laptop question, if you were to buy a new laptop, which brand would you be most likely to buy? And you give them a couple different answer options. You're basically already planting a seed in their mind. You are making them aware of maybe laptop brands that they wouldn't have considered otherwise. So it may not give a very good actual recall representation for these answer options. The last type of question response format that we discuss in this first session are scaled response questions. And scaled responses are using a continuum. So a continuum is basically a scale that is developed by a researcher to measure the attributes of some construct that you're studying. So any variable you want to study that is naturally on a continuum. For example, if you want to evaluate people's opinion about a website or the website design, you could present them with different continuum endpoints, such as cluttered versus simple, unbalanced versus balanced, unpleasant, pleasant, and so on, and then let people indicate on a scale from 1 to 7 whether they think the website design leans more towards the left, cluttered, unbalanced, and so on, versus more towards the right, simple, balanced, and so on. So this particular type of continuum is a bipolar scale because the opposite sides on the left and the right are contradicting one another. They're basically opposites of one another. They're bipolar. So a lot of these scaled response questions are synthetic. And what is meant by the word synthetic here is that researchers make up this continuum just to measure abstract variables. When a variable is so abstract, so intangible, things like attitudes, intentions, and so on, these are things that you can't properly capture with a number. Researchers tend to make up continuums to allow respondents to indicate their extent of positive feelings or their extent or intensity of attitudes and intentions. So the good thing about it is that it allows a respondent to really express a certain degree of intensity, which is great because, again, certain things are not black and white. You might feel very, very positive about something, but only mildly positive about another thing. It's not all just positive or negative. Another advantage is that it's still easy to administer and code for a researcher because it's still numerical, so numerical data is always easy to code. You basically assign a numerical code to each possible answer option on that continuum. The downside is that respondents may not relate very well to the scale simply because sometimes it's overly complex. If you give people a 10-point scale asking them how much they like, let's say, spaghetti, it's probably very tricky and difficult for people to understand exactly what the difference is between an 8 and a 9 on that scale because it may be overly detailed for the simplicity of the construct you're actually trying to measure. So in some cases, simplifying your scale to a 7-point scale instead of, let's say, a 10 or a 15-point scale is a good idea. So as opposed to synthetic scales, there's also natural scales, and natural scales are scales that are naturally on a scale. Basically, for any variable that naturally occurs on a scale. Think of, for example, years, times, how many times have you been to the store in the last month, dollars, and so on. How many times do you check your phone every day? How much money do you have in your bank account? This is all naturally countable. And that's key. But it's still very easy to administer and code because, again, you have numerical codes. And then the respondent can very well relate to the scale because we grow up thinking about these constructs such as years, times, and dollars numerically. So it's very easy for respondents to relate to that scale. The downside is that respondents may sometimes not be able to give an exact answer, only an estimate. If you were to ask me how much, let's say how much I spend on groceries per week, I may not be able to tell you off the top of my head. I can come up with an estimate of that average, but I'm not keeping track of everything I spend, so it may be hard to give an exact number. So when you're deciding on which question response format to use for your research, first of all, good idea to have a bit of a mix of everything, but it all boils down to which property you're trying to measure. The nature of the property you're measuring plays a large role in how you measure it. Think of, for example, certain constructs or certain variables are naturally dichotomous, are naturally dual. Think of, for example, have you ever heard of a certain law? Either you've heard of it or you haven't heard of it. There's not really any in between. Of course, you could have an option saying unsure, but still that would be dichotomous because you exclude the unsures. Some constructs, on the other hand, are better measured on a scale, such as the preference for certain types of products or the intensity of liking someone. That's usually not hate or love. Also, previous research studies can play a role because oftentimes in research you want to build on previous studies. You want to create continuity in knowledge creation overall. So if you want to create that comparability between your study and a previous study, it will make sense to actually adopt that same measurement scale, same measurement levels as previous studies have done. The ability of the respondent also plays a role because you could, for example, simplify your response options depending on who you're dealing with. Think of, for example, children. With children, they often use more visual continuums instead of numerical ones because kids just have an easier time relating to those types of questions. And then lastly, the desired measurement level. And by desired, I mean how high does your measurement level need to be in order to actually run the analysis you want to run. And this completely ties in with the next session about measurement level, because the way you measure your question, which measurement level completely determines what analysis you can do with it afterwards.